In the name of the one and only, we are beginning another session of the Indigo Firmament. And we are making an attempt to conclude the sessions on the perception of Islam. In the previous program, we talked about how the perception of Islam has changed or had existed in the earlier centuries. In the last program, in the last two programs, we went to India and saw how the perception of Islam generally was positive throughout its history, in spite of certain negativities here and there. And then we went to China and explored that area with the prominent character of Zheng He, the great Muslim admiral of China. We went further south into the Philippines and Indonesia, and today we are going to come back to the main stage, so to say, where the perception of Islam had generally been either vilified justifiably or vilified unjustifiably for political and ideological reasons. But before we move into that, I think it's worth mentioning that the perception of Islam had been generally positive on the African continent, especially along the east coast, where it had an effect in the sense that it presented itself as an alternative to animist thought and to whatever other local religious perceptions that may have existed. In that setting, I think Islam was not as aggressive as a quote unquote as a missionary religion in the past as it has become in more recent times. And my understanding of that is that it's the Christian religion that has a much stronger sense of mission, and Islam did not have that, but it did acquire that perhaps either in competition with Christian Europe or in imitation of it, or through its cross-pollination, whatever the reason may have been. But in East Africa, Islam existed more in the context of a mutual coexistence and reciprocity and camaraderie, along with other religions for most of its early history. Very early on, Islam reached the farthest corners of the East African coast. By the farthest extent, I mean the southernmost, along the coast of what is now South Africa, Mozambique, and the rest of it. In sort of the middle part of the African continent, along the coast of coastal zones of what is now called Lake Victoria, the civilizational dimension of Islam was also visible, in the sense that Islam developed, by Islam here I mean civilizational Islam, developed 4 languages that became a media or a medium in a local context of expanding and exploring and interchanging with the ideas with the local people. The 4 languages that the Islamic civilization developed, one of those was in East Africa. Now, from a linguistic point of view, the merger, cross-pollination, and cognate exchange of major vocabularies and terminologies always exist. And we will explore that in a minute, but let me first address the issue of how the local languages were Arabized along the coast of Lake Victoria, where Arabic became gradually the lingua franca for the East African peoples. And the Arabic vocabulary permeated Bantu languages and perhaps other languages of a lesser linguistic or numerical significance. This increase in the influence of language, of Arabic language, was such that the Arabization of it created a language all its own that at the time was called the coastal language, or the language of the coast. And the coast here is not the coast along the Indian Ocean, but rather the coast along the lake, which is today called Lake Victoria. And because of that, and perhaps to some extent the the coastal zones of the African continent too, it was called As-Sawahili, the language of the coast. And that As-Sawahili, the Arabic word, the coastal language, gradually became what we know today as Swahili. A lot of times when I listen to people from Kenya, Tanzania, Zanzibar, when they speak Swahili or As-Sawahili, the cognates are so pronounced, so clear, that it takes one to a realm of intelligibility. For those of us who may not be familiar with the term, intelligibility is where you understand generally without being instructed in the language itself, so that the language has enough common vocabulary that you can communicate at a certain limited level, of course. So that influence of the Arabic on the Bantu languages, on the Bantu language families in East Africa was kind of a unifying factor that brought the people together, especially since the eastern coast of Africa were areas where the predominant Muslim population interacted with Arabs and Persians and Chinese and Indians and other people, other nations, through trade that I think I referred to that in an earlier program, that the Indian Ocean was a free trade zone of sorts. So then the perception of Islam would have been a positive one, a modernizing one, a civilizing one throughout the east coast of the African continent. In the course of history, of course, when European Christians, Christian missionaries, tried to convert Africans into there was a kind of a clash of cultures, and that clash of culture was primarily that in many instances they came in contact with the Muslim population in Africa. Because of that, there were tensions that were raised. Remember, during the age of colonialism, that which was one of the things that was allowed was to have that European Christian missionaries, along with the explorers and along with politicians and along with soldiers, this was kind of a package where European culture and trade and business and all that was introduced to the what we call today to the third world, and that third world had become third due to the trade imbalances, the deliberate trade imbalances during the age of colonialism, where every contract and every agreement and every treaty obviously favored the Europeans. And so the trade exchange virtually amounted to an exploitation of the resources of peoples in Africa and Asia, and to some extent those in the Americas. And the trade imbalances were then also responsible for this long-term impoverishment of these lands that today we call the third world, the irrelevant third, the backward, that are at best described as developing countries, which is a political term, politically correct term for what used to be the underdeveloped world back in the 50s and 1950s and 60s. Excuse me. So the influence of Christian missionaries that perhaps challenged the Muslim population resulted in a competitive struggle. And that competitive struggle was such that then Muslims also became very aggressive in their own version of their missionary zeal, which in my estimation is perhaps a reaction to the Christian missionaries. And in many areas in Africa, that Islam is now becoming is growing very rapidly, and has resulted in a much aggressive response from the Christian missionaries from the south. In a way, the African continent has become a battleground for two religious traditions, none of which is African in origin. In most of these countries, there are Muslim populations in the north, pushing their territorial community, religious domain south, and then there are Christian groups in the south pushing north. And where they come into contact, where the clash begins, is roughly along the equator. That's where it has reached, that pretty much north of the equator. And of course, I don't mean exactly the equator, but along that equatorial region of Africa. The north is Muslim and the south is Christian. In countries like Ghana, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, of course, Kenya, in most of these countries along that coast, the Central African Republic, the major clashes, communal conflicts, and in some cases very, very violent ones that occur where Muslims kill Christians and Christians kill Muslims. The main ideology there is no longer communism and socialism and capitalism of the last century, but rather a religious ideology that is pushed by both sides. We saw the situation in the Sudan, that the North Sudanese, predominantly Muslims, and the South Sudanese, predominantly Christians, had to fight it out, resulting in the formation of the newest African nation of South Sudan. We had a variation of that also in West Sudan, where I think a combination of religious identity, economic interests, foreign ventures, including those of China and of the West, came into a clash, along with certain Arab racism of siding with the people of lighter complexion versus those who were of darker skin. So that problem, I think, is multifaceted, if we can use this term, that it's multidimensional. We cannot say exclusively that it was Islamic versus Christian, but it had some of that in it too. But since our objective here is to look at the perception of Islam throughout history, we will leave that discussion for another time, or perhaps it may not even be relevant to our general discussion. So the formation of these nation states, the clash, for instance, such as that in Nigeria, between the Boko Haram and the establishment in Nigeria, is same as in the sense that the Boko Haram is the forbidden, and the Boko is the reaction or the prohibition of westernization. And here, back in the 1960s and 70s, westernization was often explained in the context of socialist capitalist ideological differences. For most of the world, westernization and easternization, or if there was such a term, would have defined that. Then came a time when the Muslim world got involved, and here the westernization was often explained in the context of that the Muslim culture being threatened by Western ideas in terms of its values, moral standards, etc., that the Muslims felt that they put themselves on a moral high ground compared to Western values, which they thought were decadent. Well, things have changed drastically in terms of government corruptions and the rest of it. My objective here is not to be judgmental, but rather to voice the themes that were dominant back in the 1960s and 70s. So that westernization, and as it was distinguished from modernization in the earlier part of the 20th century, has somehow resurfaced in Nigeria with an additional dimension of political violence. And the conflict there is that there are Nigeria is an oil-rich country, in terms of population, the largest country in Africa. Its population is predominantly Muslim in the north and Christian in the south. And also the influence of Western Christian missionaries, like I said earlier, come into close contact with the Muslim missionaries from the north. And the result is that the society is polarized. One, in terms of corruption, generally the corrupt leaders in the south happen to be Christian. They are in charge, they are in control of their resources. They have support from Western oil corporations. And of course, Western oil corporations are supported by Western governments. And by default or deliberate attempt, then any perception or association with Christianity as a religion, that also falls in that one category. The Muslims are generally in the north, and economically they are not as well off as the Christians in the south, in the coastal areas. And they also see the westernization, Christianization, and modernization to be associated with the government corruption. And so therefore, for an organization such as Boko Haram, the driving force behind their movement is that they are rejecting Westernization, because it also symbolizes the other elements, Christianization as well. Christianization and the government corruption. Modernization is a different thing, but that's also a question of another type of relativity. So Boko Haram means the prohibition of these Western ideas. So the West is equated with corruption and the imposition of a Christian thought. And they themselves in the north being Muslims, that brings to fore a clash that is both civilizational, cultural, ideological, and religious. On top of that, the frustration of the north or any government opposition, that has nothing to do with Nigeria. Anywhere in the world where there is a dissident political ideology that challenges a state in the absence of democratic medium and processes where that dissent would register, obviously they will resort to political violence, and the Boko Haram are no exception. So they do resort to political violence, which in our modern times is automatically called terrorism, especially when it's associated with Muslims, which is a great tragedy, because in many cases very legitimate concerns of the society are ignored because of that. For instance, the campaign against polio and certain other vaccinations that the Muslim communities in Nigeria suffer from, because the very objective of being anti-Western in every way, somebody spreads the rumors that the vaccine has been made from the pig blood or some such a thing, some such nonsense, then spreads around, and people don't vaccinate their children, which in the short run as well as in the long run affects the well-being and the welfare of a society. And the Muslims in Nigeria suffer from that, which is not very different from the similar polio campaign in Pakistan, where the CIA tried to infiltrate or use the cover of this health and well-being campaign when they were looking for Osama bin Laden, and somehow the kind of the side effect of that, or the fallout from that, is a resentment towards the polio vaccination because people are suspicious of whether these doctors and nurses and health health and welfare operators are legitimate or not, and so they do not allow them to vaccinate their children, and so that sits back the campaign against polio in Pakistan and probably in places like Afghanistan and Nigeria. All in all, it is certainly not beneficial to the Muslim population there. Furthermore, it also affects the level of education, because if education is then equated with westernization, people stop sending their children to school, and we see the extreme form of that in Afghanistan and in parts of Pakistan, but also in Nigeria. So to stick to the situation in Nigeria, we see that then Boko Haram is not just targeting the government, which certainly is corrupt, but it's also targeting Christian population out of no fault of the Christian communities, but because they have fallen within this polarization. So often they target, like the situation we saw a year or two ago, of the kidnapping of Christian girls from certain townships that were perceived to be predominantly Christian, and their forced marriages and sexual exploitation of it and the rest of it. Now, since the discussion is generally in terms of the perception of Islam, the positive perception of Islam that has always existed and was much more convincing to the African mindset, in the sense that the relationship between the divine and the human was a very direct one without any intermediary. This was much more convincing to them than was the Christian concept of, and I'm talking about the Trinitarian concept, which is kind of confusing to say the least. So because of that positive, that the human and the divine were bound in a direct connection, that positive image of Islam has eroded with activities such as those of the Boko Haram, and of course the campaign by the various parties, especially in places like the Central African Republic, where not only are these the two religious communities victimized, but in addition to this being a battle for quote-unquote faith expansion, it has become a battleground for the exploitation of the feminine, the gender difference, that women are the majority of their victims. And in this victimization, in certain places, even the United Nations troops had been implicated, which is a further disaster upon disaster in the continent of Africa, which is pretty unfortunate, to say the least. But all in all, then, the perception of Islam has been tainted and has become negative in the course of time in the African continent. Now, to go back to the what I refer to as the main stage of the world, which in this case is the Muslim-Christian adversarial competition in the so-called Middle East and European theater. And I shouldn't have said the word theater, but it is in a way a theater because it has often resulted in some sort of a military campaign, whether it was the Ottoman expansion into the Balkans or the Christian Crusaders military campaign against the Muslim lands about a century ago, about a millennia ago. Or you could also add to that the colonial policies of the West in the last century or so. Now, in that context, then, we could look at it how Islam as a bright and brilliant and progressive and forward-looking, liberalizing and liberating ideology / religion has turned out to become, in the course of time, a belief system, a religious or faith identity that is equated with terrorism, with political violence, with very regressive attitudes, with draconian laws, and in a way it is the farthest distanced identity and perception that Muslims have. Obviously, this did not happen overnight. So we are going to go over that briefly, that it went through certain stages, and at the height of the colonial period, to which we referred to in an earlier program, the Muslims, the Muslim states that were probably each was the size of the entire Europe, or at least comparable to Europe. So, for instance, the domain of the Ottoman Empire, if you compare it to Europe, it was bigger than Europe, as it had portion of Europe and part of Asia and Africa, all under one government, or Safavid Persia, for that matter, or the Shaybanis, or the Durrani Empire in Afghanistan, or the Mughals in India, or the Fatimids in Egypt, and so on. So these states were much more powerful than anything that existed in Europe. But during the colonial period, the whole attempt by Europe was, in a way, to see if they could chip away at the territory of these powerful states, to make them weaker and smaller and eventually irrelevant. And I don't know if they could even predict their becoming irrelevant, but that's what has happened. We saw the northern tier countries that are Turkey, modern Iran, and Afghanistan, that were squeezed between the two superpowers of the time, the Tsarist Russia from the north and the British Empire from the south, and eventually it resulted into the shrinking of Afghanistan to half of its size, the shrinking of Iran to perhaps 80% of what it used to be, and the disintegration of the Ottomans into Turkey, which is probably now safely estimated 20th or 30% of what the Ottoman Empire was. So the modern Turkish Republic is probably 20 or 30% of in size and in population and in influence of that which was the Ottoman Empire that it replaced. In the course of the 19th and 20th century, then there were movements that fought this Western momentum. These movements were primarily non-governmental entities. The governments were corrupt. They were, in some cases, well, in almost all cases, their corruption was such that they could no longer defend, to use the word justifiably, in all these three countries, with every onslaught of a colonial power from the north or the south, huge chunks of their territories were lost. And of course the rulers, whether it was the tail end of the Sadozai dynasty in Afghanistan or the Muhammad Zais that replaced them, or the Qajars in modern Iran, or the tail end of the Ottomans, they were in no way able to compete. They put up some struggle, but the end result was always favoring Tsarist Russia and Britain. So because the government was seen as incapable of defending quote-unquote the Muslim lands, and by extension the Muslim faith, therefore their corruption was a norm, and so whatever resistance that was that came into fruition was non-governmental entities. We see prominent names such as Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani in Afghanistan and in Persia, and in parts of India and Egypt where he traveled. We see the efforts of Sayyid Ahmad Khan in India. We see the efforts of the Mehdi of Sudan, and we see the efforts of Mukhtar of Libya, for example. These were not just reformers of the minds of the Muslims to wake them up, but they were people who also took to action. And in the order that I explained, I think, from Al-Afghani to Sayyid Ahmad Khan to Mehdi to Mukhtar, the latter ones were more, especially in Africa, were more action-oriented, fighting against the European colonial powers. The first two, Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani and Sayyid Ahmad Khan, were reformists in the sense that the action part of them would have been a kind of a side effect, but they wanted to wake up the Muslim masses. There is also Muhammad Abdul Wahab in the Arabian Peninsula, whose main campaign initially was also anti-colonial and one of a Islamic revivalism to fight colonialism. What Wahhabism has become now is different than the Wahhabism that he advocated, that he followed. And in a sense, the ideals of all these leaders had been betrayed at best. For instance, in Afghanistan and modern Iran, they are fighting over the bones of Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani. They are fighting over his identity. They are fighting over his name. They are trying to give him a different identity, to confine him in the context of a cultural or a modern political nationalistic zone or kind of a frame. Whereas when it comes to his ideas, they still vilify him. So Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani's idea, which was Pan-Islamism, is totally rejected by the average the Iranian mindset, who are super nationalistic and therefore cannot accept Pan-Islamism. So they do not claim the ideas and ideals of Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani. They only want to fight over his bones identities as to who he was, not what he stood for. And the situation is not much different in Afghanistan, that the Muslim Brotherhood that eventually evolved in Egypt and was established by one of the disciples, second, third generation disciples of Al-Afghani. So when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin, it is perhaps one of the most resented expressions in the political culture of Afghanistan. But when it comes to Sayyid Jamaluddin Afghani, they will fight over his identity as to whether he was Iranian or Afghan. So again, they fight over their bones. They don't care about their ideas. And this is the shallowness of the average Muslim mindset in the 20th and 21st century. Sayyid Ahmad Khan is, for the most part, forgotten in India, just a name. Instead, those who were at the forefront of a kind of a nationalistic state for Muslims that resulted in the division, resulted not only in the division of India into Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, but in the death and demise of tens of thousands of innocent people that were divided and pushed left and right and forced migrated and slaughtered along the way, only because the plan was to have a stronger religious wall against the expansion of communism. And so therefore these states had to be created, which was essentially a British plan, and it was only adopted by the Muslim League of India that eventually formed Pakistan. So Pakistan's artificiality as a nation is just that it's one of the few artificial nations, in my estimation, the other being Israel, is that these are formed for political ideologies where religious identity is dragged into that equation. The Muslims of India that exist today are no less of Muslims than those in Pakistan. And of course the plan did not succeed because of the horrendous bloodshed that resulted from it. So the idea that we do not remember Islamist reformist, anti-colonial reformists in the Indian subcontinent, and instead we pay more attention to the collaborators of the colonialists. And in that category I would put Ali Jinnah as one. Yes, he is the founder, the great leader and all that, there's no doubt about it, but if you look at the very concept of how Pakistan came into existence, the driving force for it, then it was still a colonial plan, just as the formation of Israel was, in a sense, it had its colonial dimension. The Mukhtar and Mehdi, that's a different story. That they have too been forgotten in Africa. And Muhammad Abdul Wahhab's ideology, that was one of a religious revivalism for an awakening, for a political anti-colonial awakening, has become, in a sense, an extremist, dogmatic, religious ideology of exclusivity that has harkened back to perhaps the most conservative periods in Islamic history, of the times of Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam Ahmad Hanbal, where again what it was designed for in the 18th century is forgotten and pushed aside, and instead it is playing a different role in modern political life of the Muslims. And along with the alliance that it has formed with the Saudi family, and the access it has to the riches of this country of Saudi Arabia, it is exploiting the poorest among the Muslims, and by poorest I mean the economically disadvantaged people in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and in other areas, and are kind of brainwashing them into kind of a if I can use a Christian term of being the born again concept. So then Muslims are reconverted into Wahhabism, and through an extreme form of that. So to look at this background of the decline of the Muslim civilization, that not only are they following a continuously downward movement that is becoming worse by the day, or worse by the year, but that even the vanguards of these reforms, even the pioneers of these liberation and reawakening movements, they have been betrayed throughout this period. So that will lead us to understand the value of intellectualism in the Muslim land. Islam rose to prominence because it valued intellectualism, and this valuation of intellectualism was contextualized within a global, inclusive, civilizational framework, where if you had an intellectual orientation, a rational mind, an inquisitive thought pattern, you were welcomed into this hub of activities that the Muslims provided. Whether you're Christian, Muslim, Zoroastrian, Hindu, it did not matter. Many of the earlier scholars in Islamic history benefited from that, and many of them are assumed to be Muslim, but the Muslims had such a free-flowing attitude towards religious affiliation that, for example, Daqiqi Balkhi, to go to the Afghan history, who at one point was a Muslim and and his name was Muhammad, switched back to Zoroastrianism, but he did not lose his prominence and his place in the history. That he was not vilified, he was not killed as they would do in modern day Afghanistan, and we have never learned from that. We had great scholars like Ar-Razi, for example, whose ideas in many cases were contradictory to the precepts of the Quran. In other words, he spoke against the position of the Quran in his philosophical understanding of it, but nothing happened to him. People still respected him because he was a scholar, because he was an intellectual. And when Islam rose to such prominence as being the all-inclusive global civilization, it's because it guaranteed such freedoms. that can be easily contrasted with the current situation, where, just as I said, what has happened to our earlier reformists, our earlier revivalists, by earlier I mean those of the colonial period, and how we have betrayed them. We have also betrayed our greatest scholars and intellectual minds in our modern times, that in every country where there's sort of quote unquote a revolution, the first targeted are those who are educated, who are, so to say, the cream of the crop, who are intellectual, who are rational, who make sense. Look at Afghanistan, for instance. The first coup, and this coup was, of course, carried out by the Afghan communists, the Parcham and Khalq parties that had the support and endorsement of Soviet Russia. These were intellectuals, and they ought to have appreciated intellectualism. They were not religious fanatics, but what they did was exactly what one would expect from fanatics. They targeted the intellectual class. The number of professors, doctors, engineers, and students that were jailed and killed in mass killings in Pulacharkhi and other places. And I personally have lost many good friends, and I'm talking about not the family members, that's a totally different matter. I'm talking about scholars, colleagues at the Kabul University. So the very process of change began with eliminating those who could think, who could agree or disagree, but simply because they were not part of their ideology. I'm not an expert in Iranian history, but there is ample evidence of similar things taking place in Iran. I think there were again mass killings of certain intellectuals, and in addition to that, certain religious communities were also persecuted. So if you just take that, add to that what happened in Turkey under Ataturk, is perhaps much worse, because what is called the Kemalist revolution was not one, on the surface of it, of course, it was one of modernization, but at the substance level, it was an anti-Islamic one, in the sense that it was the Islamic identity that had to be uprooted, and European identity that had to be superimposed on the Turkish people, and the denial of a religious identity, which was then further reinforced by denying to them their entire history by changing the alphabet, and therefore making the whole nation, if there was such a thing as a nation, the whole Turkish nation, making them illiterate overnight. And they had to re-literate them into the Latin language, which then created a barrier between the people of Turkey and their entire history of the Ottomans that was all written in the Arabic script. And the great damage that this did was that it created a distance between their people and their glorious past. And by glorious past, I mean that the Turks were in the vanguards of Islamic civilization. They were active participants in a more interfaith setting that included Muslim, Christians, Jews, and the rest. A situation that is personified in the personality of Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi Rumi, that is now being glorified in the 21st century, simply because the West had acknowledged him, not because the Muslims have done anything for him. And that's very critical. So if we look at all these attempts to reform, whether it was in the 3 northern tier countries that I mentioned, or you could go to Egypt, which not only suffered then, but even in its latest phase, that the Muslim Brotherhood in recent years had been vilified for ideological objectives of the regional power politics that targets people who can think. So for them, it doesn't matter if you can think critically. What matters is that if you can think like them, only then are you accepted. And that pretty much spells the state of affairs in the Muslim world today, is that thinking is not appreciated, but imitation is. And by imitation, it implies that you have to think like them to be accepted, to be the norm and normal. If you don't, you are out. So, number one, the level of literacy among the Muslims, in the Muslim society is among the lowest in the world. And then you get a few that are educated. And what happens in the process, that a great majority of them are either killed through these political upheavals in the name of revolution, and once the revolution occur, the rest of them run for their life. And where do they run? They run to the West. So it enriches Western civilization. We have many Nobel laureates. We have many Muslim scholars, doctors, professors who teach in Western universities, which for them individually is fine. But when you look at the larger picture, it is the result of the impoverishment of the Muslim lands. And so therefore, the state and the society, and even the intellectual or pseudo-intellectual classes, are doing everything possible to get rid of intellectualism in the Muslim land. And as they do this, the Muslim lands are sinking more and more into their dark ages. And the perception of Islam then, of course, changes with that, in the sense that the expectation, or just to put it simply, the more illiterate and uneducated people you leave behind in the Muslim lands, and the more we attract the people who have skills and education and talent and intellectualism, and then you expect those who are left behind to be acting responsibly. I mean, socially responsible, politically responsible. It just does not make sense. I'm not placing blame on the West alone. I'm holding the Muslim societies to be as responsible for this fiasco as is the Western world that is, in a way, stirring up crisis in the Muslim lands that yields only one result: the brain drain. The brain drain of the Muslim lands. That, yes, the West is taking their natural resources from the colonial period, and the oil resources that has been happening for about a century now, and also the human resources, the talented human resources that flock towards the West. And on the surface of it, of course, you can blame it on some revolution and some fanatics such as the ISIS and so on. But ISIS is only one party to this conflict. I think the conflict is much more expansive and much more extended. Let's stop this here, this discussion here. We will continue in the next segment with another portion of this. So for now, I bid you farewell until the next session of the Indigo Firmament. Have a nice day.